This is specifically for squaring up fabric that is either a very tight weave and therefore you can't pull a thread out of it, or you can't rip the fabric to find the straight grain of the fabric. So any fabric that you can't pull a thread out of, either too tight or non-woven, this is how you can quickly find the straight grain of the fabric. So I just picked up this cotton quilting fabric from the fabric store. She cut it right off the bolt. When your fabric is on the bolt, it's almost never folded straight, square, non-grain. And so therefore, when they just cut it at the cutting counter, they line up the edge, whichever edge they happen to roll out, and then they cut the fabric square with the edge. Well, it's never straight, square, and on grain, ever. So when you get your fabric home from the fabric store, wash it if that's what it calls for, so that it'll take out any of the creases, and washing alone kind of squares up the grains. Then this is what you do to make your first cut straight, square, and on grain. And this is super important, particularly in home decor sewing, because oftentimes you are starting a project with that first cut. Like for draperies, your first cut absolutely has to be straight, square, and on grain. Otherwise, your entire project will be off square, and then your draperies won't hang straight. If you're making garments, you're cutting two pieces out of a folded piece of fabric, your shirt, if it's not on grain, might start to get askew on your body, or your pant leg or your skirt might start to kind of hang askew. So it's important that your first cut is straight, square, and on grain, or that your pieces are lined up on your fabric straight, square, and on grain. And if you lay your fabric down on your table and you just go by that first cut that they made at the fabric store, and you're just gonna trust that that's just because the crease is so creased from the bolt and being rolled up for so long that that's a square, it's not. So this is what you do. Pick up your fabric and fold it in half, selvage to selvage. So you've got your two selvage edges here, and this fabric, you can see I've got one selvage, and then the other side, you can't see the selvage on the printed side, but you can see that this is the selvage edge here on the non-printed side. So you're gonna pick your fabric up, fold it selvage to selvage, and line up those edges. Now, if I line up one of the ends, one of the cut ends, this end or this end, if I line that up, you're gonna see that I have this big swooping crease in my fabric. You see that crease there that's running from this top edge here down to the bottom edge by my body? That crease is indicating that this is not folded flat. No matter what I do, no matter how hard I try to shake out that crease, it's never gonna flatten. The bottom of that fold there is always gonna have that crease in there. No matter what, it's gonna be there. So what you do, and look at it this side, it's even worse. So what you're gonna do, between your fingers, you've got to slide the fabric one way or the other. So there we go. Now, you see how that crease has disappeared? And it's nice and flat. Oftentimes you'll see the edges get really, really cut off like this, where it's just really off square. So I'll show you that again, so you can see that this, the farther you get off square, the more that crease, the deeper those creases get. You see how that is? And the bottom of the fabric will never flatten out. Now I'll move it back into square, just sliding it between my fingers. There we go. Let's line up those selvages again, make sure those selvages are nice and straight. And that is about as good as it gets. Now you can lay this down on your cutting table and line up the edges. I'll show you on the cutting table. Kind of can't really do this on your table. You have to actually hold the fabric up and let it hang so that you can see that crease straighten out when you get it square. Because when you have your fabric laid on your cutting table, I could line up this edge and my selvage edge. Let's get that lined up just perfectly. I get that lined up and my selvage edge lined up. I can sort of press this and it looks like, oh wow, yeah, that's nice and flat. That looks great. And you might think that's totally square, but it's possible it's not. The hanging test is definitely the best way to see if your piece is straight, square, and on grain. So now I can take this, line up this bottom selvage with this bottom line on my cutting mat, and I can take my ruler and line that up nice and square and cut this. There we go. Now I know that this is a nice straight square cut across the weft of my fabric. If you want to see the whole video, the longer video where I talk about the warp and the weft and the way that the fabric is woven and how to pull a string out in order to find square, if you are using a piece of fabric that is way long or very wide and you can't really hold the fabric up in order to do this hanging test, in order to get the crease out of the fabric, if it's just not possible to do that, then watch this video right here and I'll show you how to pull the thread out in order to get the fabric straight, square, and on grain, and I'll see you over there.